When we think about colonial power, you know, the big picture stuff usually comes to mind, armies, economics, that sort of thing.
Right. The obvious symbols of control.
Exactly. But what if some of the most effective tools were, well, quieter, more fundamental? Today, we're doing a deep dive into something really fascinating, the British East India Company, and its surprisingly intense focus on the languages of India.
It's a crucial angle because really, how do you control a place, trade effectively, or even, administer justice if you don't understand how people communicate?
Yeah.
And for the British in India, facing this incredible diversity of languages, it wasn't just practical, it became strategically vital.
Absolutely. We've been digging into Bernard Cohn's work, specifically colonialism and its forms of knowledge. Lots of insights there from archival records.
Yeah, Cohn's work is foundational for understanding this.
So our mission today is to unpack the strategies, the huge challenges the British faced with India's linguistic landscape, and crucially, how all this tied into their bigger colonial goals.
Right.
Okay, so let's get into it. What first pushed the East India Company to even, bother with learning local languages? Was it immediate?
Well, initially it was purely business, really, trade.
Just the bottom line.
Pretty much. They needed to buy, sell, make deals with local rulers, understand the sort of basic legal rules around commerce. Simple as that at the start.
Okay.
But as their footprint grew, so did the need for, actual administration, dealing with legal issues beyond just buying textiles.
So not driven by some grand intellectual curiosity at first, just necessity.
Exactly. And their first move was, the obvious one, use local help. They relied heavily on intermediaries.
Like translators.
Yes. Figures like the dubashes, often interpreters and agents and vakils who were like legal reps, and akans, scribes and teachers. These were the people who had the language skills the company men lacked.
The go-betweens.
Absolutely essential go-betweens. Diplomacy, trade talks, even figuring out what was going on locally, gathering intelligence. Cohn points out in Bengal, these two languages men were vital, writing and interpreting local languages and Persian.
Makes sense. You arrive somewhere new, you need someone to translate.
Yeah.
But I imagine relying on intermediaries like that must have had downsides.
Oh, definitely. Big time. It was necessary at first, but risky. There was always the chance of, mistakes in translation, obviously.
Sure.
But also deliberate manipulation. And maybe more importantly, these intermediaries, they had their own interests, their own networks. Their goals weren't always going to perfectly match the company's.
Right. You don't want your entire understanding filtered through someone who might have their own agenda.
Precisely. That gap, that dependence, is really what pushed the British towards needing a more direct line of understanding.
Okay, so that dependency forces their hand a bit. What did they find when they started looking more closely? What was the linguistic reality they encountered? It wasn't simple, I'm guessing?
Oh, far from simple. The sheer number of languages was, mind-boggling for them, and a huge practical problem.
More than they expected.
Way more complex. You had Persian, which was still kind of the administrative language, a legacy from the Mughals. That was important.
Okay, so Persian for official stuff.
But then alongside that, you had this vast range of regional languages. Hindustani, Bengali, Tamil, Marathi, so many others, each totally distinct.
Wow.
And then you had Sanskrit, the ancient language of religious texts, scholarly work, which held enormous cultural and, crucially, legal weight.
So it wasn't like learning Indian. It was like learning Europe, almost.
Yeah.
Multiple major languages, plus classical ones.
That's a good analogy, actually. It was this incredibly intricate web. And you can see how that complexity would be a massive barrier to, say, setting up consistent laws or administration across different regions.
Yeah, how do you apply the same tax code or legal ruling if you can't even communicate clearly or understand the local terms for things like land ownership?
Exactly. It made uniform governance incredibly difficult.
Must have been overwhelming for those early officials. But Cohn suggests some individuals did see how vital language was, even early on.
Yes, definitely. There were company officials who got it. They understood that language was key to actually ruling effectively.
Out of necessity.
Mostly, yeah. Some guys, just because of their jobs dealing with local courts, trying to sort out disputes, they basically had to learn languages, sometimes several. It wasn't, official policy yet, but these individual efforts were happening. They were kind of the pioneers.
So these individual struggles, plus the realization that relying on translators wasn't ideal, that kind of paved the way for something more organized.
Precisely. It created the momentum for a shift towards a more systematic approach.
Which brings us to the rise of formal language study.
What?
When did the company really start trying to structure this? What did that look like?
You see a real shift around the late 18th, early 19th century. The big move was setting up institutions. Fort William College in Calcutta, founded around 1800, is the key example.
Fort William College. So this wasn't just like a general college for the British guys.
Yeah.
Language was a core thing.
Oh, absolutely central. Its main purpose was training British officials in Indian languages, not just speaking, but reading, writing.
Right.
And a huge part of that was translating key texts, legal codes, administrative manuals, and crucially, they started the work of actually creating grammars and dictionaries.
Ah, okay. So not just learning the languages as they were, but actively trying to codify them, making the tools themselves.
Exactly. It's a subtle but really important point. They weren't just passive students. They were actively shaping the knowledge about these languages in a way that suited them.
Interesting.
And they put a lot of emphasis on the classical languages, Sanskrit and Persian. The thinking was, understanding these unlocked the deep legal and intellectual traditions of India.
Give them a kind of historical legitimacy, maybe?
Perhaps, or at least access to the frameworks they believed underpin the society. And figures, often unnamed in the documents Cohn looks at, but key individuals, put in immense effort compiling these dictionaries and grammars. Monumental tasks.
So this effort to create linguistic knowledge, how did that become a tool of control? This seems like where it gets really powerful.
Absolutely, because by creating these grammars, dictionaries, textbooks, they were essentially standardizing the languages.
How so?
Well, they often had to choose, which dialect becomes the standard Bengali or Hindustani that gets taught and written down in their books.
Ah, so picking one version over others.
Right, and that choice has power. It elevates one form, potentially marginalizes others. It affects education, who gets published official recognition.
Wow, yeah.
And then there's translation itself. It's never neutral, is it? Translating Indian legal or cultural concepts into English wasn't just word swapping. It meant filtering those ideas through a British legal and intellectual lens. They were interpreting, reframing.
Imposing their own understanding onto it almost.
Inevitably, yes. Think about administering law, or the big one, land revenue. The British had to understand local terms for land tenure, inheritance obligations. But by defining those terms in English, in legal codes based on their system, they were fundamentally reshaping those relationships and asserting control.
It's like the act of translation becomes an act of subtle conquest in itself.
That's a strong way to put it, but yeah, there's an element of that. You define the terms of the discussion.
But it couldn't have been totally smooth sailing, surely. Did they face challenges, resistance?
Oh, it was definitely not smooth. Hugely challenging. Accurately capturing complex cultural ideas or legal nuances in another language. Sometimes it's almost impossible.
Things get lost in translation.
Exactly. Meanings get diluted, distorted. Cohn mentions cases where this lack of deep understanding led to serious misinterpretations in court or in administration. Big mistakes were made.
Because a dictionary definition just doesn't cut it for some concepts.
Not at all. It lacks the cultural weight, the context. And while Cohn focuses on the British side, you have to imagine the frustration for Indians dealing with officials who just didn't fully grasp the nuances.
Yeah.
And there would have been resistance, surely. Maybe subtle things using local terms among themselves, maybe strategic misunderstandings going the other way, things that don't always make it into the official archives.
Right, the unread story. Okay, so stepping back then, looking at the long-term effect of all this linguistic work, how significant was it for the British colonial project overall?
It became, indispensable, a core tool of power. Having this command of language, even if imperfect, allowed for much more effective administration, more centralized control over law.
Made the bureaucracy work, essentially.
Yes, and it also helped them spread their own ideas, their own systems of knowledge. It wasn't just about practical communication anymore. It was about shaping how Indian society itself was understood, categorized, and ultimately governed.
So language wasn't just a tool. It was woven into the very fabric of colonial control.
Absolutely. It was fundamental. A way of knowing, classifying, managing. By defining the linguistic landscape, or trying to, they exerted a really profound type of influence. Cohn's work makes that incredibly clear knowledge, specifically linguistic knowledge, was power.
That's powerful stuff. We started off thinking about language as maybe a secondary aspect, but it's clear it was right at the heart of it, an active instrument.
Definitely.
So, reflecting on this, what does it make us think about today? What's the takeaway?
Well, it really pushes you to ask, doesn't it? How does the power to define language, to categorize it, maybe even to translate it, still shape how we see other cultures, other societies now? Are there less obvious ways that language still acts as a tool of influence, maybe in global politics or media, or even just how we, frame debates about different groups?
The power inherent in naming things and defining them. It definitely makes you think about the words we choose and the frameworks we use, consciously or not. Lots to chew on there.
Indeed.
Well, thanks for digging into that with me. Really fascinating.